From the very first wave, hitting the shore at 6:30 a.m. on that fateful day, everything that was supposed to go right went horribly, catastrophically wrong. The critical pre-landing aerial bombardment, designed to clear out the entrenched German positions, was a massive failure. Instead of obliterating the concrete bunkers and machine gun nests, most of the ordnance fell miles inland, leaving the German defenses untouched and ready. This preparation delivered absolutely no benefit to the American troops coming in. The crucial DD amphibious tanks, a key secret weapon meant to provide supporting fire as the first soldiers landed, never made it. They were launched too far from the shore. In the freezing, turbulent waters of the English Channel, dozens of these tanks sank like stones. The Armor Corps, who were meant to be the saviors, instead became victims under the water. The loss of these tanks left the initial waves of infantry completely exposed to enemy fire. The landing zone, codenamed Easy Red and Fox Green, was not a beach. It was a killing zone. The German positions, far more heavily fortified than intelligence predicted, were ready. They unleashed concentrated fire from relentless machine guns, mortars, and short-range artillery, turning the beach into a meat grinder. The minute the landing craft doors dropped, hundreds of soldiers were instantly cut down, swept away by a merciless, invisible scythe of bullets. The soldiers who managed to survive the initial hail of fire were instantly trapped. They huddled behind the inadequate shingle banks, trapped between two relentless threats: the rising tide, which would drown them, and the suffocating volume of German fire. Orders became useless. High-ranking officers were killed or wounded immediately. The radio communication system was destroyed. Chaos reigned supreme. With every passing minute, Omaha Beach got worse. Bodies piled up, staining the water crimson. Fear and despair were the fastest spreading elements. Many of the young green soldiers were completely paralyzed, unable to advance, unable to retreat. They could only wait for death. On the command ship just offshore, General Omar Bradley, overseeing the entire operation, watched this unfolding tragedy through fragmented but terrifying reports. He could not believe what he was seeing. Omaha was not a tough landing. It was an absolute, unrecoverable disaster. The casualties were far beyond the acceptable limit. Minute by minute, he began drafting the final, devastating contingency plan: abandon Omaha. The largest amphibious invasion in history, the hope for liberating Europe, was on the brink of total collapse within the first hour. This was the disaster Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cota was sailing straight toward.
Narrator: Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cota was not built like the other men in command. He wasn't supposed to be an infantry commander on the sand. He was the Assistant Division Commander for the 29th Infantry Division, a staff officer. His job was to observe, report, and coordinate from a position of relative safety. He was known as a detail man, an analyst, obsessive about preparation, a characteristic that would prove vital because he knew exactly what the textbook solution was and why it was wrong. But Cota had one core belief, a creed that separated him from the brass above him. You can't get off the beaches looking good. You gotta get off the beaches alive. He splashed ashore at the absolute peak of the carnage, well ahead of schedule and into the thickest part of the German fire. Most accounts of military leadership are written from the comfortable seat of command ships or safe bunkers. Cota's story is told from the waterline, wading through the bodies of his own men. Visual: close up on Cota's face, grim and determined, framed by smoke. Narrator: he encountered not just chaos, but paralysis. Broken men were huddled, mentally shattered. Companies had lost every single officer. The beachmaster, the man responsible for organizing the exit, was frozen by despair, unable to give an order. Cota, ignoring the constant, deadly sweep of fire, stood up on the shingle bank, making himself a massive target. He brandished his sidearm. He was not asking, he was commanding. He delivered one of the most famous, unscripted, and brutal rallying cries of the entire war. Sound: voiceover shifts to a harsh, aggressive tone, with background gunfire momentarily receding. Cota, voiceover, urgent. Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let's go inland and be killed. It was a stark, brutal, and paradoxical command. He didn't promise them safety. He promised them a better death, a fighting death, away from the water's edge. This single burst of aggressive, visible leadership was the first trickle of energy on that desolate beach. But the real career-ending danger wasn't the German enemy, it was the invisible enemy of the chain of command. Back on the ship, General Bradley was finalizing the decision. He was ready to pull the plug, considering diverting the rest of the troops to Utah Beach, a tactical retreat that would have fractured the entire D-Day operation. Cota's radio, still functioning just enough, caught the chilling possibility. Orders were coming down the line to the surviving officers. The directive was to pull back. This was the critical moment. Cota knew the orders were correct by the book. He knew following them would preserve the reputation of his superiors, but he also knew that retreat meant certain slaughter and the failure of the entire war effort. What gave Cota the absolute certainty, the iron will to defy a direct, existential order on the morning of D-Day? It was the knowledge that his analysis on the sand was superior to the analysis on the ship. The High Command had missed the small, crucial gap in the German line, a tiny, defensible exit point Cota had spotted under fire. He took a long, hard look at the map, then at the carnage around him. He made his choice. He did not radio back. He did not ask for confirmation. He defied the order. Sound. Music swells dramatically, then fades to a low, suspenseful hum. Narrator. But that defiance was only the beginning. It was the action he took next, the three unconventional, desperate, and brilliant tactics that truly turned the tide. And it was these same actions, his greatest triumph, that the official history would later try to bury.
Narrator. Cota, standing on that bloody shingle bank, knew that following the official retreat orders was a death sentence for the entire operation. He had just committed an act of monumental defiance. Now he had to justify it. He didn't have the luxury of time, only the burning wreck of a landing zone and a few hundred demoralized men. He had to replace the failed doctrine with pure battlefield improvisation. He executed a series of 3 tactical maneuvers that were unconventional, desperate, and utterly brilliant. Tactic 1. The scrappy engineers defying doctrine. Narrator, the first breakthrough came not from infantry, but from those least expected, the engineers. Cota spotted elements of the 146th Engineer Combat Battalion huddled together, men trained to clear mines and build roads, not fight entrenched German machine gunners. They were waiting for orders that would never come, paralyzed by the sheer carnage. Cota voiceover, demanding, "Those men are trained for demolition. Get them moving. Don't clear a path. Blow a path." Narrator. He ordered them to ignore their defensive position and instead use their satchel charges and high explosives to attack the crucial German seawall and barbed wire obstacles. This was a massive risk, essentially using unarmed sappers as frontline shock troops. But Cota saw their primary function, explosives, as their primary weapon. Visual, dramatic, slow-motion shot of a satchel charge being placed on the seawall, then an explosion creating a usable gap. Close-up on the fear and resolve in the engineer's eyes. Narrator. They managed to blow several crucial gaps through the wall. These were not the main, easy routes the plan called for. They were tiny, jagged holes, but they were breaches. For the first time all day, there was forward momentum. Cota had just taken a unit considered useless in the chaos and turned them into the spearhead of the invasion. Tactic 2. The two-man attack, targeting the unthinkable. Narrator. The German fire was concentrated on the expected landing points. All logic dictated that troops should reinforce the center. Cota rejected that logic. He understood the German defense was a series of strong points, wider stances, each with interlocking fields of fire. Assaulting them head-on was suicide. Instead, Cota found 2 unassigned rangers, elite but isolated. He pointed them toward the impossible. The steep, vertical bluffs at the edge of the line, a path the Germans believed was impassable and therefore barely defended. He sent 2 men to flank the entire German position. Visual: POV shot following 2 heavily burdened Rangers scrambling up a steep, muddy bluff, away from the main fighting. Narrator: it was the ultimate show, don't tell moment. Using a path Cota himself had scouted under fire, the 2 Rangers managed to navigate the terrain and silence a key German machine gun pillbox, WN-60, from the flank. The moment that pillbox fell, the entire defensive line of fire shattered. Cota was not just fighting the enemy, he was fighting the enemy's strategy. By disrupting the fire support network, he gave the pinned-down troops in the center a chance to breathe, and then a chance to move. Tactic 3. The rifle, not radio leadership. Narrator: Cota's final tactical genius wasn't a formation or a flanking move. It was his physical presence. He refused to leave the beach. He became the living, breathing, unkillable center of command. He saw that the soldiers' biggest enemy wasn't the bullets. It was the paralysis of leadership failure. He personally pointed units inland, creating impromptu platoons from survivors of different companies, using nothing but his hands and a single, clear directive: get off this beach. He grabbed the arm of a bewildered colonel and shouted, "Where are your men? Where is your support? You are leading them, Colonel, not hiding." His visible, aggressive leadership shattered the soldiers' fear. It was a massive, high-risk psychological gamble. Every soldier who saw the general, a star on his helmet and a rifle in his hand, walking upright under fire, realized, if the general's still fighting, still giving orders, then we still have a chance. Visual: archival footage/reenactment of Cota organizing groups of disparate soldiers, pointing inland with his hand. The image quality shifts to emphasize reality. Narrator: it was this direct, rifle-not-radio leadership that transformed frozen fear into forward momentum. By the afternoon, the small, desperate gaps blown by the engineers were widened. The flanks were weakened by the Rangers, and the men, inspired by the general, began to scale the bluffs. The beachhead, barely alive, was finally secured. Omaha was a victory, but the story was far from over. The greatest battle Cota would fight was not against the Germans. It was against the very men he had saved.
By the late afternoon of D-Day, the tide had turned. The beach was secured, the bluffs were scaled, and the invasion was back on track. General Bradley was able to breathe the first sigh of relief all day, and he quickly diverted the rest of the 7th Corps to Omaha. It was a victory, a narrow, terrifying, and profoundly costly one. But the moment the bullets stopped flying, a different, more insidious battle began. The battle for the narrative. The Army's general staff, including figures like Bradley, were relieved, but they were also terrified. The truth about Omaha was a political and doctrinal nightmare. Cota's success, his brilliant improvisation, was inseparable from his act of monumental defiance. He had saved the day, yes, but he had done so by violating the core principle of military discipline, obedience to orders. If Cota was publicly lauded, it would set a dangerous precedent. What message would that send to every other officer? That in a crisis it was acceptable, even encouraged, to ignore the high command? The military machine, built on rigid hierarchy and predictable execution, could not tolerate that kind of radical, individual heroism. Order, the system believed, must triumph over individuality. The cover-up began subtly, immediately, and effectively. The 2 main reasons for the silence. First, the staff needed to protect the reputation of the high command. admitting that the original plan was so flawed that it required a subordinate general to openly defy orders and save the entire operation was unthinkable. The failure had to be minimized. The success had to be institutionalized. They couldn't allow Cota to stand out as the lone genius because that would make the strategists above him look incompetent. Visual. Faded archival photo of high-ranking generals looking stern and formal. Text overlay. Protecting the doctrine. Second, the reports needed to be sanitized. The official narrative had to smooth over the sheer terror, the paralysis, and the magnitude of the near catastrophe at Omaha Beach. Cota's own aggressive language, his famous quote, his personal charge were deemed too raw, too dramatic, and ultimately too messy for the historical record. His role was quietly diminished. His actions, which saved the entire day, were simply absorbed into the general description of determined leadership by multiple officers. Cota was not officially reprimanded. That would draw attention. Instead, he was simply sidestepped. His promotions were delayed. He was quietly relegated to less visible, less glamorous roles in the subsequent European campaign. He had committed the cardinal sin of being too right and too successful by the wrong means. He became the ghost in the machine, the man who won the most critical battle of the war, yet was almost completely omitted from the triumphant narratives and the major history books for decades. The silence was deafening, and it was engineered by the very system he fought to protect. They managed to control the narrative for a generation, but historical truth, much like the general himself, eventually finds its way off the beach.
Narrator: Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cota finished the war, but he never received the highest battlefield commendations that his actions at Omaha Beach truly warranted. He continued to serve, but his name was consistently relegated to the footnotes of military history. He retired in 1947, his brilliance confined to the memories of the few hundred men who saw him stand up on that shingle bank and dared to follow him inland. The silence had done its job, but historical truth, unlike political narratives, cannot be suppressed forever. Decades later, military historians began the slow, meticulous process of excavating the archives, analyzing the after-action reports, and interviewing the surviving soldiers. They consistently found one truth: Cota's defiance was not just heroic, it was essential. He had correctly analyzed the situation on the ground, realizing that military doctrine had failed, and that only improvisation could save the day. Cota's story isn't just about D-Day. It's a timeless lesson in leadership. It teaches us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It is the willingness to sacrifice your career, your safety, and your reputation to do what is necessary when the rules guarantee failure. The true hero is the one who understands that, in a crisis, order must yield to action. The silencing of General Cota was the bureaucracy's attempt to erase the inconvenient truth that their system almost failed. Sound. Uplifting, reflective music swells. Narrator: The men of Omaha Beach fought for victory. General Norman Cota fought for survival. And in the end, that defiance saved D-Day, ensuring that the greatest act of courage was not the one planned in the briefing room, but the one born out of absolute desperation on. Narrator: What did you think of General Cota's defiance? Do you believe the army was right to suppress the story to protect the chain of command? Or was it a historical injustice? Let me know in the comments below. Your opinions fuel the conversation and keep these untold histories alive. Visual. full-screen graphic asking a question and prompting comments. Narrator, and next week, we uncover another buried truth. The real enemy that Winston Churchill feared most was not Hitler's Germany. It was a terrifying secret he kept from the public until his death. Click here to watch.